Hello, everyone. Welcome. So as people are trickling in, why don't I do some starting things? So the Center for Ethics and Human Values welcomes all of you to the first Conversations About Research Ethics event of the semester. CARE is a year-long interdisciplinary series of faculty-led conversations that goes deep into the ethical issues that arise from research programs. So we move a little bit beyond the regulatory oversight and talk about the problems that vex the good-hearted and socially responsible researcher in their day-to-day practice. The program is it's sponsored by the Office of Research with support from the OSU MC Center for Bioethics and the College of Public Health. Please also mark your calendars and join us for the upcoming CARE events. So in October 22nd on Tuesday, we're going to be talking about the ethics of paying research subjects, touchy subject. And then in November, on Friday actually, we're going to be talking about the ethics of community-engaged research. And you can go to the OSU CHV CARE site and you can find all the events. And also there is this handy sheet that talks about all the autumn's Center for Ethics and Human Values events. So we're excited today to talk about the ethics of co-authorship in research. Thank you all for coming. We kind of recognize that right now scholarship is rarely, if ever, done alone anymore. I'm a philosopher, so this is new to me, but for scientists, this has basically been the MO for forever, and we're just sort of catching up. And it's a really exciting opportunity. Two of the people on our panel are actually STEAM members, which is STEAM Factory members, which is an interdisciplinary collaborative group sponsored by OSU. And there's all this energy around collaborative research and big science, and also really incorporating the humanities and sciences together in these interdisciplinary projects. And the questions that, there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also a lot of potential ethical challenges, right? So today we're going to be talking about that, and we have a really exciting panel of speakers. So let me just really quickly introduce the speakers and tell you about the structure of the event. So we have Haising Deng, who is a philosopher with a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, who is soon going to be starting a 4-year postdoctoral fellowship at University of Leeds, basically thinking about precisely this topic, about the ethics and epistemology of collaborative research. We also have Dr. Cynthia Carnes, who's a senior associate dean in the College of Pharmacy. She has a lot of expertise and background in collaborative research, but has also served in a leadership position thinking about a lot of ethical issues regarding research integrity. We have Sandra Enemil, who is a licensed lawyer and librarian, who's the Copyright Services Librarian at OSU. Thank you for coming. And she's been working on helping researchers navigate copyright law and informing all of us about authors' rights and also how to manage our rights as creators of content rather than just as users. We also have Catherine O'Brien, who has a PhD in evolutionary biology and works as an outreach coordinator at the Museum of Biological Diversity and is also now a postdoctoral fellow in the STEAM Factory. And her aim is to increase diversity in STEM and to develop connections between OSU and the community. And finally, we have Susan Williams, who is a professor of English, and among her books that I think is topical for the occasion is Reclaiming Authorship, Literary Women in America, 1850 to 1900. She also has served in leadership positions in faculty affairs and grad education, including Vice Dean of College of Arts and Sciences and the Vice Provost in the Office of Academic Affairs. So thank you very much for all you to come and share your experiences and your thoughts on this very thorny topic. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna give Haising 15 minutes to just sort of present some of her research and some of the ethical considerations that she thinks are really prevalent when it comes to collaborative research. And then as a group, we kind of set up through talking and email exchange, we came up with a set of questions that should frame the discussion in a nice way, and then we should have about 30 minutes at the end to field questions from the audience. So think about those questions and write them down as you're listening in. All right, so thank you, and so no further ado, we'll have Haiseen come up. Let me know if this is annoying.
Oh yeah, this is fine. Yeah. Hi, thank you. First, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic today because it's the topic of my dissertation. So as philosophers, as Dana has mentioned, most of our works are single author, or 2 or 3 authors mostly. That's sort of the limit of how big the author list gets. But in science, co-authorship is the norm, and very large co-authorships, right? So we have teams of dozens of people or 20 people, but sometimes there are author lists that number hundreds, and in some areas of physics, for example, and high energy physics, observational astronomy, there are author lists with thousands of people on them. So how are we supposed to think about the relationship between the authors, right, and the research output that comes out of it, that is sort of attributed to this really large group of people? It's a really difficult topic because I think so many disciplines have different norms about what constitutes authorship and how one would read an authorship list. Obviously, a high energy physicist, if they look at their 1,000 person authorship list, they interpret it very differently, right, than someone who is used to working in a small lab with just 5 or 6 people. But just to kind of zoom out a little bit more, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about my research. So as a philosopher of science, I am mostly interested in conceptual and methodological issues in science. And I'm also particularly interested in ethical issues that arise in science in practice. And one of the major parts of scientific practice is dealing with other scientists, and how we should, and it's crucial, right, to a career of a scientist, how we relate to our collaborators, how to find good collaborators, how to maintain those relationships. And those relationships are crucial to the scientific outputs that are generated. So I study how a group of people can know together and work together. So for example, one of the key questions I ask in my research is, so I'm going to come over here. One of the key questions I ask in my research is, who is the bearer of scientific knowledge? Is the bearer of scientific knowledge the individual scientists? Is it the team of scientists, the collaboration, or is it the scientific community? We often attribute knowledge to the scientific community, right? We say things like, scientists tell us, but who is exactly the bearer of that knowledge? And why do we even care about this question? Well, it's really important if we want to hold people responsible for scientific knowledge to know who has ownership of that knowledge, right? Who is responsible for that piece of knowledge. So in biomedical research, this question is really important because if a group of doctors and scientists make a recommendation for how long one should go between screening for lung cancer, for example, and this ends up being, and this recommendation ends up being bad, and people end up dying because they didn't get screened often enough, right? We want to be able to hold scientists responsible, right, for generating things that are false or things that were sloppy or I mean, there's a whole list of different types of errors that might occur, some intentional and some unintentional, because we don't want those errors to perpetuate into the future. one of the other questions I ask in my research is, what are the responsibilities and obligations that co-authors, collaborators have towards each other? And this is something that I think scientists talk about quite a bit amongst themselves and also in the training of scientists, but I think it's a question that has been sort of overlooked in philosophy, and especially in philosophy of science. So a lot of my work is looking at what sorts of relationships exist in collaborations and what kind of obligations sort of arise out of those kinds of relationships. Okay, so what is authorship, right? That's the big question that we're here for today. And it's been defined several times by different sort of medical journals, by committees. So there's two major committees, one called COPE, which is the Committee on Publication Ethics, and the ICMJE, which is the International Committee on Medical Journal Editors. And those are the two kind of major committees that have sort of actually set a definition for what they think authorship is. So the definition of authorship is roughly the same, but what is important to the idea, the concept of authorship, is that it conveys a significant amount of privileges to the people who are named authors, and responsibilities and legal right. And this legal right is actually really important in biomedicine because so much of the research have patent pending on them, are very marketable, they're a part of big business, right? So who becomes an author, who owns the data, and the research actually, it can be really contentious, right? There's like sort of litigation around it. But it also forms a basis for rewards and career development. And the other parts of authorship, obviously, one has to have actively participated in the research. One have had to, so the ICMJE recommends that every single collaborator, every single named author have to have had final review and endorsement of the final manuscript. So those are, and these sort of rules for who constitutes an author is really difficult to adjudicate as research teams get bigger and more complicated, because it's very much the case that in large collaborations, or even small collaborations that are very complex, or where people are kind of coming and leaving out of the collaboration, that not every single person who's listed as the author have read the final draft of the manuscript. And this happens all the time in working collaborations, yet those people are, of course, named authors, but that is one of the requirements for authorship in these guidelines that are often failed. Conceptually, or from a philosophical perspective, what constitutes authorship to me is a concept which I call epistemic responsibility, and it's an epistemic responsibility rather than sort of a moral responsibility, right? Although, of course, in scientific collaborations, we have moral responsibility as well. Like, for example, don't lie, right? Don't falsify your data. That's both an epistemic responsibility and a moral responsibility, right, to not falsify any data. But epistemic responsibility used to be sort of a simple concept, right? If you think about the history of science, when science wasn't done in these big, large teams, epistemic responsibility seems pretty straightforward, right? Charles Darwin is the author of The Origin of Species, and he's the sole person who is epistemically responsible, right, for the contents of the Origin of Species. Of course, he cites people in the book, right? But the main ideas we know are attributed to him, and he's the one that and this happened, right, in Darwin's lifetime, that after the book came out, a lot of people had lots of questions, had a lot of criticism for his work, and they were directed towards him, and he was responsible for writing responses to those criticisms and questions, right? And that's what he did for many years after he published The Origin of Species. However, today, that kind of straightforward one-to-one relationship where one person is epistemically responsible for the work, right? One person is the author of a work, no longer stands because of large collaborations, because of the way that science is done today. And so individuals within a collaboration are no longer straightforwardly responsible sort of in this one-to-one relationship to the output of the research. People are in fact responsible in teams. They're responsible in different ways, and they can be responsible in different degrees, right? There is this, and one can be more responsible and less responsible. And this is often reflected in author lists by people who are listed as first authors, as last authors, right? And also many journals today have required people to submit contributor statements where where the authors are required to list what exactly they have contributed to the piece of research. But to make these kind of questions a bit more concrete, I have a couple of examples of sort of failures of authorship or authorship disputes, and they often, I think this is the most, you see it most when articles get retracted, right? When something has gone wrong in the collaboration, and authorship disputes is actually one of the main reasons why some papers are retracted. Okay, so well, first there's this very famous case from the 90s that involved David Baltimore, who is a very famous Nobel Prize-winning cell biologist, and he was collaborating with a young PI. Her name is Teresa Amarashi Kari, and they. So I'm going to kind of skip over some of the details of exactly what was going on in the science, but they published this paper that was kind of made a big splash, had an unexpected result, and the other co-PI, she asked one of her postdocs to replicate the experiment. So this is after they published the paper, and she wanted to keep working on the results of the paper. She asked one of her postdocs to replicate the experiment, and the postdoc could not replicate it. And then the postdoc became convinced that the data in the original paper was falsified. And so this was a subject of a very interesting book called The Baltimore Case by David Kelvis. It's a great book in the history of science, and also if you're interested in science policy and politics in science, it's a great book. And eventually, so the postdoc brought up her complaint, right, to the research board of the university, and the whole case was really crazy, right? I mean, it was like a subject of a very thick book. But the result was that many of the co-authors of that paper, so I think there was 5 or 6 people on that paper, they all retracted the paper. They decided to retract the paper, except for Teresa Amarashi Kari. She stood by her research, and David Baltimore, who's sort of the biggest name on the paper. I mean, he's a Nobel Prize winner, and he trusted the co-PI, and he refused to retract the paper. And for that, he was both criticized and praised, right? So here's a case of what kind of responsibilities do we have to our collaborators, right? Are we supposed to stick up for them, and sort of our boats are tied, right? That I'll sink if you sink, right? Or do you jump ship, right? So you have this case where the other authors on that paper decide they all said, okay, I'm no longer, I'm going to retract the paper. I no longer stand by the contents of the paper. But David Baltimore actually he stuck with the paper. And the case went through many years of investigation and litigation, and it was at first the first investigation she was found guilty of misconduct, but then it went through appeals, and she won her appeal, and she was cleared in the end. So it was a very complicated case. But through this time, David Baltimore lost. He was named the president of Rockefeller University during this time when this was going on. And he had to give up the presidency of that position because he was criticized for being sort of attached to this misconduct case. So we can kind of, I hope that case is interesting, right? We can kind of discuss. I'm looking forward to what the other panelists have to say about what they think about this case, right? Whether or not, as a co-author, you have that obligation to stick with your co-authors, even if they were accused of misconduct. Some other interesting, in recent cases, or that was a case from the 90s, more recent cases, so this one is from Pittsburgh, actually. So the Allegheny Singer Research Institute, which is a hospital system in Pittsburgh that does a lot of cancer research, they had a paper retracted in 2014 from the Journal of Applied Biomaterials and Functional Materials, because the PI of a clinical trial on which some of the study is based was not included as a co-author. So this is a really big, big clinical trial study, and involving several PIs, right? So they were all co-PIs, and this paper came out in 2014 that left out one of the PIs, and this PI who was left out actually sued the Allegheny Hospital because he was left out, right? Because he said that they used his data without his permission, right? And the paper was eventually retracted, and as far as I know, the case never went to trial. I think they settled out of court, and so the PI, again, who was left out of the paper, said that because he didn't validate the accuracy of the data, that the study should not have been accepted, right? And this raises a really interesting question, right? Again, if you have a group of co-PIs, who own the data, right? Who is the rightful author, right? Who's the rightfully responsible for this data? And there's another case actually at OSU. So I was looking for some interesting cases to kind of bring to you guys. And there was actually an interesting case from OSU also in the last couple of years. Maybe you've heard of him. His name is David Croce, and he is the subject of several misconduct cases right now, but before the misconduct cases, he was involved in this authorship dispute because his postdoc that was in his lab, so they were working on a project together and they gathered a lot of data together, right, as a lab, and then his postdoc left. And then his postdoc published a paper using the data that had been collected while he was a postdoc with Croce, right? And so he wanted, and then the postdoc wrote this paper, and then Croce was not listed as an author, right? And so he wanted the paper retracted because, again, the problem is, well, who owns the data, right? Is it because, so the postdoc said, well, I own the data since I actually did the actual work, right, of gathering the data day to day. I actually did, I was in the lab doing the experiments, but Croce's the PI, right? And I think the case went through, again, investigation and the university actually decided that the PI is the one who owns the data, right? And the paper was retracted. So these are really pressing issues in research ethics, right? Who has the right to publish papers based on data that are, in some sense, collectively generated, right? Even though, of course, but of course, in biomedicine, especially, who owns the data is really again, it's a subject of patents. It's this subject of people make money off of these studies, right? So it's really important for the PIs, right, to claim ownership over the data that come out of their labs. To again open up for discussion is what we want authorship to be, right? So I think there are journals have guidelines for what we think authorship is, and criteria for how one should meet in order to be listed as an author. But obviously these guidelines they're not one size fits all, right? And often people don't meet those criteria, right? Especially, like I said, this criteria of every single member of the collaboration is supposed to have read and approved of the final manuscript. That often doesn't happen in collaborations. So what do we want authorship to be? And so I want to leave here with the thought that it's because what we want, how we should structure authorship in the future, or how we should change the guidelines for who should be an author, or whether or not we should just move into a contributor sort of model complete altogether, right, with no authors, just all contributors. I think the important thing there is to think about how we want to structure the reward structure of science, right? Because right now, why we run into this kind of tension between who should be an author and why scientists fight about, they sue this one of the cases I told you about, right? They sued the hospital, right, because they were left out as an author, because there's great rewards, right, for individuals to be named the first author or be on an authorship, because career advancements are individualistic rewards, right? You get promoted, you get hired as a individual. You don't get hired as a team, right? Or very rarely does this happen, right? Almost all of, who is hired and who gets promoted, who gets tenure, who you invite into your collaboration, right? These are all individual rewards. The Nobel Prize in Science, right, is only given to individuals. Only the Nobel Peace Prize, which is a political prize, right, is given to groups. So all the scientific Nobel Prizes are given to individuals. So the major rewards in science are individualistic. So that's in tension, right, with a lot of what happens actually day to day, because people work in teams, right? And it's often very hard to separate out, well, whose idea is that if we came up with it together in a lab meeting. But the tension with authorship is this, we're trying with the authorship list, right, to pick out the individuals who are most responsible in order to reward those people in the future, right? So that those people can get hired or get tenured, right, or get their big promotion, get a big grant. And the reward structure of science is individualistic, so that puts pressure on scientists to be the first author, right? To always want or to get their names on the author list, right? So I think so in order, I think, to answer the question of what we want authorship to be like, or what it should be, right? We want to think about what should the reward structure of science look like in order for the author list to make sense, right? How should we give out awards? How should we make tenure decisions, for example, right? That would make sense of how we should capture those responsibilities on an authorship list. Okay, so that's it from me, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody else has to say.
And so now I'll invite the panelists to come up. There are name tents. Feel free to switch around. Great, thank you. And thank you, Haiseen, for a really real set of tricky questions, and some that are a little bit closer to home. So maybe this is, I think I'm going to just start with the first question, because I think that it in some ways relates to this sort of normative question. It's both descriptive and normative. It's both like what, so I'll say the question. So what does authorship mean to you, right? And How are the responsibilities of joint authorship understood in your field of research? Now, what does authorship mean to you could be both just what it means to you as you do it, or what you would want it to be in ideal circumstances. So feel free to just go down the list.
Okay. All right, so yeah, I'll start. So I'm Sandra Inamill, Copyright Services Librarian here in the University Libraries. And so what I do is I talk to faculty, staff, and students about using and creating copyrighted works. So for me, what authorship means is very technical and what US copyright law says it means. So it's dealing with who has created or authored a work. For joint authorship, which is the discussion today, I wanted to just read what US copyright law says. A joint work is a work prepared by two or more authors with the intention that their contributions be merged into inseparable or interdependent parts of a unitary whole. So I think, I'm just gonna make it a little bit closer. Okay. Is that better? Yeah, sorry. For me, I think for the work that I do, it is really around helping people understand their rights as creators of content, and then if they're working with other people, making sure there's conversations and discussions about how those rights and those rights work within the work that they're planning to create together.
Hello. I guess for me, when I think about co-authorship, the thing that I'm always thinking about, and I think you've touched on some of this, is that each person should have contributed something substantial. And I think that's where there's a lot of debate and discussion about what constitutes substantial or substantial enough. A substantial portion of the work that they would stand by, be able to defend. I think, to me, that's an important part. I think one of the elements that I really struggle with, and I think you see this at some journals, is they want you to assume responsibility for the entire work, which, of course, when you get into these situations, as you mentioned, of hundreds or thousands of authors, becomes virtually impossible. So I think that's one of the big open questions that I see right now.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a postdoc, and so I might be approaching this from a little bit of an idealist point of view, because authorship to me is something that is still very personal. And for me, it really signals the completion of a project and this idea that we have in science that the scientific process isn't done until you communicate your work. Now, this being said, there is a little bit of a tension then with how we communicate authorship to other young scientists and negotiate it within our labs. And this is a talk that has been happening at some of our conferences, notably the Evolution Conference had a panel recently on authorship and what the tenets of authorship should be. And that becomes very individualistic based on the lab or the environment that you're in.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Susan Williams. I want to thank you, Dana, for letting a humanist be on this panel. I always love having that, and because of that, I brought a few words too, because that's how I think. So the question is, what do I think of authorship and what do I think of joint authorship? And my quick answer to that is that in the humanities and in English, we don't do a lot of joint authorship. It's mostly still single-authored monographs that are the sort of gold standard in our research. And if there is joint authorship, as in philosophy, it's usually one or two people working together and really both actually writing and thinking through, and in some cases, holding themselves up in a room to actually kind of trade off writing sentences. So it's a very much a kind of single author. But I thought, since, as Dana mentioned, I've done some work on the history of authorship, I just wanted to get a couple of ideas out on the table quickly about how else I think about authorship based on my research. So if you can go, yeah, so I put up an image of Louisa May Alcott, and this probably summarizes in some ways how I think about authorship, but still how I think humanities and particularly literary scholars still think of it. And that photograph is a single author with a pen in her hand, thinking good thoughts and being a really solitary author. And there is no data to own other than what's in your head. And there's this kind of idea that you're also a solitary genius who somehow can come up with really wonderful ideas and maybe put them in a creative work, but also I think that idea comes forward even in scholarly realms in the humanities, that you're responsible for sort of sitting and thinking through data that is usually historical archives or some other scholarship and synthesizing that and putting that in. And so to me, this author kind of, that sums up the single author. The quote that I put there, I just wanted to have hovering in the air as we talk about the questions of mentorship and working with others. And this is another, to answer the question of co-authorship, this is kind of getting to it. What I put up there is a quotation from a letter that Louisa May Alcott wrote to someone, her name was Miss Churchill, who wrote to her asking for advice about how to get into writing. And so this was mentorship, it was a form of working together. And what Alcott really wanted to emphasize when she answered that letter was, it's not easy to be an author, and I worked really hard to get it, and I'm not going to give you that title very easily. And I feel like that is something that is still very much in the air, at least in the humanities, but I think also to get to this question of some of the authorship disputes, the Nobel Prize winners of the world have worked hard to get that title, and they still want to have that authorship kind of there, whether they've read it or not, probably because they've worked hard to do it. So the real keywords I look at in this image are that those who get the title of author have earned it, and that is the best sort and the most enduring. So what does it mean to earn the title of author? And I think that's kind of the question behind some of the questions of reward and recognition for authorship. So I think of it as a solitary, I think of it as engaging with hard work and also being a point of production that is very much with ideas. I put up one more, I just have two more quick slides to get us started. The second one is some writers that have been very influential on my idea of authorship, and I thought I would throw them out in case anybody wanted to pursue this. I'll just say a couple words about them and why they've been influential. So Mark Rose, and I know we have a copyright expert in the panel, but he is a literary historian who wrote about really the first copyright case in England that involved a literary author, and that was Alexander Pope, who sued because there were letters he had written to someone that a bookseller published without his permission. And so it was a question of what was propriety, and also what was property. You know, there was kind of a coming together. But the point of that article, which came out in 1991, which was right as I was finishing my PhD, it's been very influential in humanities studies of authorship because it got the idea out that legal definitions of authorship, and thank you for reading them, preceded actually the idea of professional authorship, of there being an actual category of author, because it was the issue of who owned the property. And once you had a legal framework for that, then you had discussions about who had the right to earn the title of author. And so that was very influential. Then there was a debate in the 1970s that kept getting traction, continues to, between Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, both they originally wrote these ideas a year apart, and it's a long, complicated pieces, but the essence of it, which I think is still relevant, is that Roland Barthes wrote this essay called The Death of the Author, because he thought that looking at authorship, he was looking primarily at literature, but I think in general, he thought was not helpful in terms of what the real purpose of reading is, and that this question of sort of whether you're a contributor or whether you're an author, that it was the idea that if you think about an author, you're always worried about the biography of the producer, and you're thinking about the intent of the author, and in fact, what's important is what you make of what's put forward, either as literature or a scholarly article. It's what you do with it. So he put a lot of emphasis on readers and on the receiving end of works, and said that authorship as a category basically precludes a lot of real open access and use to ideas that's important. And Foucault didn't agree with that. That's why he wrote an essay that's in the present tense. The author was not dead. He said, what is an author? And he said that it's largely a function. And I think that's a useful term to have as we think about what an author is, because it plays a particular function. In the scholarly world, it definitely plays a function of saying, who should be responsible for any breaches of data, who should be contacted if they can't replicate, if there's not a replication, et cetera. But there's also a sort of legal and compliance function. And so Foucault said, yes, we need to think about the reception and what you do with ideas, but he also said the author is an important originator. He called him also kind of a scripter who gives us something to work on, but we need that point of origin. So that's been a big debate kind of throughout English studies, is whether you focus on the receiving end of any work that's produced, particularly in scholarly or literary worlds, or whether you work on the produced end, and they kind of have both sides. And then this last one, Lisa Eade and Andrea Lunsford, that was published in the top journal in English called the Publications of the Modern Language Association in 2001. This is a sense of how long it's taken for the humanities to really talk about collaboration. It was 2 women who wrote it, and that's actually kind of like this panel. That's where joint authorship and collaboration mostly happens in English. It's been women and feminist scholars who've started co-writing more than any other group. And this is one of those teams. And their essay was really about the fact that authorship was connected to that keyword authority, and that it had risen out of particular sets of legal and market conditions, and was largely related to modern capitalism and intellectual property, and then to patriarchy, and that it privileged autonomous individuals, and it would therefore be important to have a feminist critique of that as a practice that did focus on sort of more equal teams coming together that are not so hierarchical and are not so privileged. And that's been something that's not really completely taken off yet in English studies, but there are some examples of joint authorship coming, but it's largely been considered a feminist practice, which I think is interesting. And then finally, very quickly, this third slide I just wanted to put out because it came up actually this week for me. In my department, we're doing promotion and tenure cases, and we're talking a lot about reward and recognition. And this is a quotation that was in one of the external review letters for a case in my department. And although I think in general those are confidential, we live in a public documents world, and I'm not going to say who this was specifically, but this person very much wanted the idea of collaboration to get out there, so I feel okay in quoting it. And it's referring back to Bart, who I talked about, and another critic who talked also about thinking about authors and readers together. But here's the thing that I think is really useful. The very nature of our work as scholars demonstrates the integral part that collaboration, whether implicit or explicit, plays in our writing and thinking. Academic institutions need to acknowledge collaboration as a valid, necessary, and desirable form of scholarship, for it is often a matter of degree that separates the explicitly collaborative work of scholars actively working together from that of scholars whose work includes one name on the byline. And that's the world where humanities is coming in, that often it might be acknowledgments or it might be in the footnotes, but it's always collaborative. And so everything is jointly written. Even that single author, Alcott, had a lot of influences, and that's, I think, an interesting way to think about it.
Thank you so much. I just want to add a little bit to this really wonderful overview of literary authorship. And I just want to say a little bit about the history of scientific co-authorship. So the first scientific journals were the Proceedings of the Royal Society in London, England. And the very first proceedings that were published in the 17th century, if you look back in the archives, the first couple of issues, a majority of those pieces that were written in the proceedings were actually, so the Royal Society, all the natural philosophers or the scientists of the day would gather together and demonstrate to each other sort of the results of their experiments. So there's all like air pump experiments, like experiments with optics and mirrors and prisms and things. And then the proceedings were actually a record of what has occurred in these in-person meetings. And that's the first scientific journal. And the first issues of the proceedings a vast majority of them were unattributed. They're anonymous. So we actually don't know an experiment was only described and the results were described, but it was not attributed to a person. And that was in the first couple of issues. And then eventually the editor of the proceedings, whose name is escaping me, but he's one of the architects of the scientific journal as we know it, he decided that we needed to know who to credit for major discoveries so that the historians could know who to attribute these major discoveries to because they knew they were doing important work. And of course, the Royal Society is a male-only society. It was only, I think, up until like the 20th century that they allowed women in. But it was, and they were all gentlemen, right? So it was, so the name that was attached to a piece of discovery had, you were supposed to trust it on the name of the person who said it, right? Because they were, often very rich, had titles, very well off people in England. And I want to say, and I just want to mention the first co-authored paper that we have records of was published in the 17th century, and it was a piece of astronomy, observational astronomy, where it was attributed to 5 or 6 people because the data was collected from all 5 of these astronomers, right? So all 5 of these astronomers, but it's unclear who wrote up that piece, right? It might have been the editor even, right? The editor might have just combined the data, but it was attributed to 5 astronomers because the data came from 5 people. And that was the sort of the first instance of co-authorship in a scientific journal. So I do think you can kind of see, through the history that has a lot to do, like scientific authorship has a lot to do with credit, about who you can trust, right? Who you can find to ask questions about the research. If you wanted to replicate someone's experiment and you can't do it, right? Who do you call to ask, right? Or who do you write to, right? To ask how to get this experiment to work. But also, why people collaborate is because of we need many people to generate the data that is needed, right, for scientific work. And you kind of see that in the history of science.
Thank you, Hyson. So one sort of note about the gendered makeup of the panel. This is accidental. I actually invited some men who at different levels in their career, and the responses, I didn't invite that many, but like the responses were a little bit like, in the earlier career, I don't have anything to say that is interesting. I haven't thought about the topic that much. And so I think it is really interesting how much of this work is being done by women, and also how much expertise. It seems like there's a lot of thought that is going on it's interesting to see the history and how women are also doing this sort of like ethical and
recovery work.
And recovering work, yeah. Great, thank you. Okay, so next question. So what are currently the greatest obstacles to ensuring that all collaborators receive their proper credit, either institutionally or in terms of publication norms? Are there any journals or institutions that you know of that are currently trying to creatively access these concerns? If so, please share.
Am I just going? Okay. I would say, so just speaking from conversations that I have with people who come to visit me to talk about copyright or issues related to authorship, how people are not maybe receiving their proper credit is that there isn't a conversation or discussion that's happening around the work that's being done. So as we, as people who are in academia, we know that there are contributions in, I'm writing, I'm doing research. There are also contributions that happen in, I'm a part of the team and I was there for the discussion and I contributed my thoughts in that way. And sometimes those thoughts aren't captured. And there isn't a way to, but when you see it crystallize somewhere, you know that was from a conversation that you had, but you weren't acknowledged for that. And I think there are, Hassan talked about ways in which essentially the tenure process contributes to a lot of this, and there are a lot of reasons why I think I would like to dismantle the tenure process, but and like nobody wants to, like everybody wants to, but nobody wants to, right? So, and I think it contributes to a lot of the challenges that we have in this space, and I totally agree with that. And I think part of it is, also why there aren't conversations that happen, because there's a hierarchy. There are people who are untenured, the tenured folks, and then, you just kind of suck down the fact that, you didn't get credit for or didn't get acknowledgement in a publication that happened. And there's no real way in most of our disciplines for people to get some kind of acknowledgement for that. I guess there are ways like in an acknowledgement section, but you typically see more about thanking librarians in that, or thanking one's mom or partner, not necessarily people who are like going in and having conversations and discussions with you about this or bouncing ideas off of you. So I think that's one of the ways in which people just don't get the credit that they deserve in that. I think the question about like how their journals or institutions are creatively addressing this, I'm not sure that I have seen that. I think there are some other ways in which journals are thinking about the like co-authorship largely, but I think there are a lot of issues with that. So with a number of scientific journals, especially in the US and other countries as well, there are federal mandates, so journals have been changing their signing policies in response to federal mandates that exist for authors who need to put either their publication, their articles, or their data into open repositories, so there's acknowledgement about that. Yeah. There's also acknowledgement of people who are partnering faculty who are partnering with staff. And so the authorship is jointly owned with the staff, so it wouldn't be the staff person, it would be the institution. So if I were a staff person, I collaborated with a faculty member, the publication would be co-owned by Ohio State and with the faculty member. And so there are some journals who are acknowledging that kind of a challenging situation where someone would need to have Ohio State sign and be an author along with them. So they are thinking about that, but the ways in which I think there's a challenge to that is oftentimes publishers, journals, are asking for a transfer of copyright. And when they're asking for a transfer, they need to have all of the signatures, but oftentimes you see that there's only one person who is signing to transfer, and that's not possible to do. But nobody's really looking at these agreements, nobody's reading them. So this often goes by and like nobody's challenged it, so there's that. So I think that's all I had to say about that.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I'll keep it concise. I think the things that I see in my spaces, I see a lot of collaborative groups working together, and you've got people at all levels, from the new graduate student to the postdoc to the research scientist to the faculty member, and then you do that times 4 or 5, right? So then we've got all these different people at different levels, and I would say especially for trainees, I think they are really relying on their principal investigator to advocate for them. And unfortunately, it sometimes comes down to strength of personality, attention to detail, things that may be beyond your control as a trainee, and can lead to a lot of hard feelings down the line. And I've sat in the room and had these discussions after the fact as we're finishing a paper, and I can remember one of my colleagues, who I love dearly, saying, my grad student doesn't care about where he is on the author string. And I said, but he said, just put him like in the middle, because somebody else wanted the first. And I said, but he did like 80% of the work. That doesn't make any sense to me. So we ended up having a very heated discussion. I said, well, let's invite him in so he can tell us what he thinks. And he said, well, he doesn't care. And I said, well, when he comes in here and tells me that, then I'll believe it. So, but I think, if you're not keeping your eye on it and you don't know the culture and all these different groups, and sometimes you're collaborating with people, they're not even here. They're at another university, they're in another country, you have no idea. And I think this is where it gets to be incredibly complicated. One thing that I'm happy to see, and I know the Office of Research has one, I know that there's one out of the University of Pittsburgh, are these sort of early project authorship agreements that can be drawn up, where you sort of scope out what your contemplated scope of work is, and you think about these things in advance before you start. who's going to be the first author, what's the author order going to be, who's responsible for what, who's going to be the corresponding author. I don't see people taking that up as much as they could, but I think it's a good idea because I think when you get to the end, it's very easy for things to drift. And I guess the other thing besides power that comes into this is that there are sort of cultural and scientific upbringing norms that can vary wildly. And I think often faculty think that their trainees think just like they do. And they often do not. So, I think if you don't have explicit conversations, it's incredibly difficult. So I really encourage people to think about those things early. Unfortunately, it's usually the trainees that are interested in having those conversations, which can be incredibly difficult to initiate, I think, when you're not in the power position. So one thing that I've been thinking about sort of internally for our college and then at the CCTS, where I do some junior faculty advising, is sort of requiring that students and trainees present that or think about that as part of their annual process so we can see it's not them saying, I don't trust you. This is the way some advisors would perceive it. You don't trust me. It's just like, this is a requirement. I need to have this filled in. So I think that's something we can think about at least.
I just wanted to throw out real quick what you mentioned. The Ohio State University does have an authorship guideline document. And I think it lives in the Office of Compliance.
I think Office of Research Compliance.
Yeah, Office of Research Compliance. So if you're interested in taking a look at that, it does have the agreement disclosure statement. So you can kind of go through and talk about the different roles that people might have, and it kind of helps you walk through it. So, I mean, it's something where if you are, that person that's maybe in not the power position, it could be something you work through yourself to kind of get your thoughts together to have a conversation, or something you work with as a part of the team. So.
Well, I completely agree with everything you guys said, and a lot of what you're saying, Cynthia, also resonated because that's been my personal experience and the experience of many of the early career scientists that I've worked with. So I would say that our biggest challenges are knowledge and support, and this extends to doing collaborations and thinking about how to work with people across the disciplines. When you are in a project, like I work with public librarians quite a lot, they have a very different estimation of authorship than I do. And so we have used the authorship requirements and authorship guidelines, even just as a project requirements and project guidelines, to roll that conversation out. So I will skip most of what I was thinking because I think you did a wonderful job of pressing out some of the problems and point out a couple of places that I've seen some interesting solutions thus far. One of them is making sure that there is an understanding of the hidden curriculum of graduate school and academia for people who may not have experience in this from somewhere else in their life, or more, it may come to academia from a more disadvantaged position than other students. So first generation people with disabilities, people of color, and women often fall short or fall into some of these personality pitfalls when just dealing with their PI, who may not look like them, but assumes that this person has the same expectations, rights, and ideas that they do. So one thing that I've seen crop up in the sciences is the societies taking a more active role and breaking up some of those expectations of what being raised a scientist means. My personal experiences with the Society for the Study of Evolution, and one interesting thing that they have done, mostly under a lot of pushing from Duke and Dr. Mohammed Noor, is doing a lot more training and workshops and tables for early career scientists around ideas of what it means to be an academic, alternative academics career, so how to work with communities and other disciplines. And then also providing resources like Dr. Noor wrote a book on surviving your first years as a new faculty member, things to look for. And he also gave a presentation on authorship guidelines, essentially the 5 different parts of a science project. and how authorship order should be reflected by who contributed to those parts. Again, taking personalities out of the room and being like, well, if you've done 80% of the work, you should be first author. If you funded the work, you should be last author, and negotiate the middle early and often.
We'll go back to this to 2 more slides, if that's okay. So the question of dismantling tenure, I understand what you're saying. I also oversaw tenure in the university for about 6 years and saw sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly within that. I understand. I agree with you that it would be a way to rethink it, but it's definitely something that trickles down on all of our thoughts. So I did put up a slide of the current OAA Office of Academic Affairs, which is the Provost's office, its statements about multiple authorship. This is their policy, and I worked on this policy a little bit, but it's actually had a change in the past year, which I look at as both a challenge and an opportunity. And the change is that you now you're required to say a percentage of effort that you made, as well as give a narrative idea. And we used to say, give the narrative, you can give the percentage if you'd like to. I think the thinking then was it's more important to be able to articulate what you did, particularly to get to your point about cross-disciplinary. You know, it may be really different depending on if you're in a cross-disciplinary co-authorship, it's going to be a very different thing. We will see how that goes in terms of the percentages. I think the challenge, and those of you who are faculty and have been in tenure meetings, as you know, you probably know this, is to kind of keep both the qualitative and quantitative descriptors on the table. Sometimes it just boils down to you didn't do enough of something over X percent, and that's the end of the debate. And I think that is not looking as much at what the sort of overall side is. But it is very hard to go back to your Nobel Prize Baltimore example. If somebody's there who may not have even really done that much, but they're not a very big percentage of the contribution, but they're a very big percentage of what got it published and what's there. So that it's tricky in that way, but I just wanted to put that up. In terms of solutions or best practices, Dana, if you want to just go quickly to, there's 2 more slides, and then I have no more slides, so I just want to get these out. I want to give a plug to a undertaking at Michigan State University called the Humane Metrics Initiative. It's funded by the Mellon Foundation, which is a foundation that supports work in social sciences and humanities in particular. I have the website address up there for the Humane Metrics Initiative. And what they're doing is starting with the values of what should be recognized in scholarly outputs in the humanities in any case. And then working backwards to have particular examples of how to give credit. And so a particular example, to go to that word contributor that you used, is that they're looking at annotations, which is a pretty big thing in the humanities. You might all have a collaborative document and be annotating particular words or images or bringing in your expertise in a group document. How do you begin to make sense of that? And that's beginning to break down the idea that there's a single author, or even an author at all, and it's kind of going with that. But these are very big values. They're not, they're ones that I think we would all agree with the exception perhaps of open access for everything. That's a big one. But collegiality, quality, equity, openness, community. I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, though, to go look around on their website, because this idea of humane metrics, I think, ultimately could go beyond the humanities and social sciences. And then the last slide, Dana, in terms of this, to add on to what we were talking about that our own institution gives in terms of authorship pre-agreements, which I agree is a best practice. This is a link or information about an arts project that was done at the University of Michigan. I seem to be having a lot of Michigan illusions right now, but by a man named Bruce Mack, who also had Mellon Foundation funding, proving that this is getting some interest from foundations, and he was looking at how artists integrate into multiple authored work. And actually the sciences came up a lot because artists do a lot of drawing for scientific ideas, and the artists consider this decorative, decorative contributions, which they're not actually as interested in, and they're really trying to think how to be truly integrated into collaborative ideas. But what I love about this document the most is that they put together an example of another kind of planning document. It's the same idea of agreement about pre-authorship, but it's thinking when you are in particular working across the disciplines. And I have a copy of it, and I can, if anybody wants to look at it up here, you can see it afterwards. But it has, in particular, one question, which is, what do I hope to gain from this collaboration? And having that discussion, and it's things like advancement of personal and professional research, which is not surprising, but it also has enhanced creative practice, discovery of new knowledge that can subsequently enhance student learning, discovery of new knowledge that can improve the quality of human life, so making, what kind of discovery are you doing? I'm trying to document achievement that can be applied towards promotion or tenure, just getting that out there at the beginning and separating that out. Direct financial reward, that's one. It's kind of trying to say, let's be honest about all of the dynamics that are going on as we divvy up this project and talk about them up front. And I think that goes even one more step beyond the pre-authorship, which does think about the role, but doesn't think about why you're interested in this project at all and what you're hoping to get from it. And I think that idea of thinking about what your own hopes are individually, going back to that, every individual does get the rewards. What are you trying to get then helps figure out what your role should be, and I like that as a model.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's said here, of course. I think, of course, having a before the collaboration gets off the ground, having an agreement about what the authorship list is going to look like, not only helps, clear up any confusion at the end, but also I think structures the collaboration in better so that things don't slip through the cracks, right? You assign roles for, well, if you're going to be first author, you have to take the lead on this paper, right? But another thing I want to mention is it's called the credit system, and it's this taxonomy that has been adopted by several journals now, like some really high-profile ones. So I think Plios 1, for example, uses it, and it has a set defined list of roles that people can have in a collaboration. So things like writing the manuscript, editing the manuscript, contributing graphs and figures, collecting data, analyzing data. But it also very interestingly has fields like administration, supervision, and securing grants, right? And so this is kind of what people call like a film credits kind of system, right? That in some ways you break down the roles of the collaboration and people put their names in according to what categories, what work they did, and you get a much more transparent look at what has happened in a collaboration. That the PI, right, who is often the one who does the supervision and secure the grant, right? He's properly, or he or she, right, is properly accredited, right, by this taxonomy. So I think that's a really promising way to go, and I think several journals have adopted this, and I think it's something that could, if more and more people adopt this, it might, again, it will help people structure their collaborations better. And one thing I also want to add is that, so much of what we're talking about, right, is writing the scientific paper and manuscript writing. And often, even in large collaborations, it's often just a couple of people who are writing. It's very difficult. You can't have 1,000 people writing a paper, right? That doesn't happen, right? So even in very big collaborations, it's usually a couple of people who are actually doing the writing. And that usually is a signifier that you're going to be a first author or something where you'd get more credit, right, for the work. And I think so I think in structuring collaborations, it will be really useful to, especially in training graduate students, is to think about like what goes into the writing process, right? And how do you write the paper, and also, of course, following through and making sure that you get credited, right, for actually writing the paper.
All right, so we have touched upon the other two topics so one of the topics was just sort of navigating hierarchies. And one interesting thing that I think came up is that maybe this isn't the responsibility of the individual. I mean, it might be the responsibility, but we also have to think about sort of structures to make these sorts of navigations and conversations happen at the outset rather than when conflicts happen. And the other question was about how we hold each other accountable. And so I think that in the interest of time, it might make sense to open up the conversation for other people. If other people have questions for the panelists or experiences that you want to bring up, maybe may I have, I guess I could hold so raise your hand and I'll bring the mic over.
Thank you for the talk so far. I've really enjoyed it. I worked at a contract research organization for 28 years prior to coming to OSU, and I served as a PI on a grant. And when I transferred to OSU, the grant did not transfer with me because the contract research organization kept it. And so my question is, do I own those data? Can I publish those data? In other work, they have said that they will not participate in publications unless they're being given, wait for it, $30,000 for a single publication. So it's, in some ways, it's sort of holding the data for ransom. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that. Who owns the data, and how do we fulfill this scientific endeavor by getting the work out there?
Are you going to repeat the question, or should I?
think,
yeah. Okay. So who funded the research? That's always the first question. So, typically for federal funds, they're awarding, it's a conversation I often have, they're actually awarding the grant to the institution, not to you as a PI. But, interestingly, there is a obligation, contractual obligation, and I think an ethical obligation. I, as a taxpayer, would want to see what your work product is, which is why we're supposed to be putting things into open data repositories and putting it out there. So, boy, what would I do? I might call my program officer at NCI. I don't know. I just don't know. You don't have an affiliation with your former employer. It doesn't sound like, or it's not warm. I don't know. That's my thought. Other people may have other ideas.
Other questions?
So just kind of going off of the question just recently and some in the introduction, data gets mentioned quite a bit. And having worked a little bit in that field previously, I'm aware that copyright often doesn't belong to data, as well as, there's entirely different intellectual property policies and that sort of thing that govern these, as well as contracts and funders. So the way I've heard this characterized in the past is that the publication is the coin of the realm in academia, and the data set is the collateral behind the publication. Do you guys have any reflections on if or how you would start to describe authorship or creatorship or whatever you want to call it around data sets?
Thank you for the question. That's a really, really good question, and I think it's something that, I think this big, large-scale data sets is only a very recent thing, and so I think this is kind of like up in the air, who owns the data sets, right? And often, if you have lots of people who are contributing to one data set, the data set itself doesn't have an owner or an author, right? It's a collaborative thing, right? It's an actual collaborative thing. I'm not really sure, but I think given how industrialized, right? A lot of parts of science have become, and especially in data science, right? These data sets are big money again, right? So I think it actually just comes down to, you know, who can profit the most out of the money that they'll probably try to claim ownership over the data, right? Unfortunately, but that seems to be more and more like the case that's happening now. But I think this is great, and I think it's something that we need to think about more and go into the future as science become more data driven, right?
So one thing I'll say is some of those big data sets are, you know, freely accessible, right? That is the premise of some of those. And I think really where the intellectual property comes in is you conceiving an idea, going in and querying it, sifting through all this stuff to narrow it down to some interpretation. I think that's really the intellectual property. And I think that's what's really different from data that you generate at the bench. I think now you're relying on these sort of large, public, variably curated data sets to draw from, and I think that's an area I'm really waiting to see how that's going to evolve, because I think it's an interesting area.
Ohio State has a research data policy that I encourage people to take a look at. And I mean, you guys are exactly right, and we've had conversations about this time and again. So the expression of that data, the distilling it down into something that turns into scholarship, copyright applies. Yeah, copyright doesn't apply to data. So yeah, I definitely encourage people to look at OSU's policy on that.
I don't know if this is exactly a best practice, but in the area of digital humanities, which is growing for getting lots of archives of primary sources pulled together, annotations, in terms of, I'm not sure if this is at the heart of what you're saying, but reward and recognition of the people putting that together. The model in the humanities is to think of it more like an editorship and to really ask them, again, to kind of write about what they've done and to write about the theory that put it together of curation and all of that. And the most important thing, and this was a big deal in the humanities, is that when you're getting peer review of these, that they are peer reviewed when you put them together, and that you make sure, for example, with promotion and tenure, when you're looking at peer review, that the person reviewing it has access to it in the state in which you're putting it in the digital format. And that was a big deal in the humanities to get to that point. But I think the question of sort of counting it is really important, and I saw that when I was looking at promotion and tenure across the university, that there was a lot of disagreement about what kind of work that was. Is it service? Is it service to the profession to be putting data sets? Is it service? Is it teaching? Because maybe you're doing an archive. Is it editing? And I think that's why a lot of the advice was to really reflect and write about it, and maybe even publish a kind of sort of sense of how you put together that data set. I don't know if that carries over in the sciences, but that's how it's being handled in digital humanities.
Yeah. So in some ways, this does carry over into the sciences. Sorry. So there are a number of databases that have been talked about in such a way, like contributing to Flybase, which is the Drosophila database for genetic and phenotyping information, or Fishbase, which is for the curation of fish and the location of fish at different museums, or VertBase. There are so many of these. And the ideas around, like, the oftentimes undergraduate or graduate student who is doing a lot of this data entry, how do we then credit them if they do not necessarily publish on it, because the coin of the realm is the publication. If the publication isn't out there and written up in a digestible way, the data collection in some ways from the bench or from these large databases doesn't count. I will say that you earlier mentioned PLOS One as a journal, and it's an interesting history of where that journal came about from, which was the idea of getting some of this data out in a more speedy and more credited way to try to break down some of the stalling points where you have these wonderful large data sets that people have contributed to, but the bar to jump over to get a peer-reviewed publication in something like the Proceedings of the National Academy or another large journal, especially a print journal, was too high of a bar for the I have a lot of fish and they're super interesting paper that you may want to publish. And so that was just a really interesting way of starting to deal with the digitization that I wonder if the digital humanities may want to think about.
Thank you for that. Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about it.
Hello, my question is about community people who are not part of the academy at all. So we've talked a lot about the ways in which people who have a lot of power or the money get put onto things when their contributions may be only sort of at the highest level. And we've talked about how students and trainees and other junior people may or may not get attribution even though they may have put in a lot of the work, only sort of if somebody thinks of giving it to them. And I think the idea of how sometimes leaders of community organizations are absolutely essential to getting scholars access to whatever it is they're trying to study. And so sometimes the lead author will think of offering authorship to a community member and may have more or less success in bringing that person into the sort of academic process of writing a paper. But I guess I would like your thoughts on sort of what counts, because some of the groups that I work with, the folks don't have PhDs in epidemiology. They're not going to be able to contribute to a manuscript in the way that other people on the team do. And yet they make substantial contributions, and so we do think about them as co-authors. But anyway, I wonder if you all could riff a little bit about how communities of scholars that you are engaged with either are or should be doing that. Thanks.
So an example that I have of that where community members are brought in as co-authors would be with oral histories. So what a lot of scholars in archives, folklore, that sort of thing have been doing is when they're doing an interview with a community member that they're studying or they're trying to bring attention to or whatever it is, they're doing a joint authorship with them. Because what's produced is often a sound recording, and you can have copyright in a sound recording. And so they are creating joint authorships where the subject of the interview or what have you is also a joint copyright owner. And so that is acknowledged in some ways in whatever they eventually do output. So whatever the scholarship turns out to be, they have them listed as a co-author, at least of that interview that was done with them. So that's one way that I've been seeing some work of how you involve and give credit to people who are community members that you might be researching or studying.
So for me, I would say I tend to look at what discipline it's going to go into, because often they'll have pretty specific things, has been brought up as to what constitutes authorship. While I think there's things that everybody would sort of agree are author-worthy, there's some variability from discipline to discipline. So I think it's really important at the outset, and I feel like if I were the academic partner and I was thinking about where am I going to publish it, I think it's my obligation to sit down and sort of look through, this is where I think it's going to go, this is their expectations, and then sort of communicate that out in a clear way. Because I think sometimes people don't have, as you point out, if you're not an academic, you don't have that framework to think about it. But there are written documents out there for a lot of things, the American Physiological Society, there's just a ton of different ones, and you can look at them and sort of see what fits.
I would just add real quick, an IRB also often has a lot of ways that you have to communicate and talk to people about what's happening with what's going to be produced.
Yeah. And so when I work with my outside of academic collaborators, I take the same standpoint that I would with working with undergraduate or graduate students, which is that I put myself in the position to help be their advocate for doing this kind of thing and making sure that if we're targeting a journal, it's a journal that will allow them to be represented in their authorship and that they will check enough boxes so that that can be published. I will also say that every time I give a poster or a presentation at an academic society meeting with data from my community partners, they are always on the poster. I think it's very important from a historical point of view to also make sure they're included because as we already talked about, part of authorship is making sure that the people who do the work get the credit, and it becomes much more important when those people don't have an easy way or an understanding of the academic culture to be their advocate and help them be part of the historical record.
Just one other thought I have about that is that there's the question of whether you include them on an academic publication that's fair, that has all of the restrictions that come with that. And part of my question with that would be, yes, in theory, we should be very there should be reciprocity and kind of counting them, but there's also the responsibility part, and they may or may not want to be the responsibility part and assuming that. But I think it's really important in terms of reward and recognition in our scholarly world to say that if you weren't a co-author in a scholarly journal or a scientific journal, but you did write something about your project in a public-facing, sort of non-academic publication, so on a blog, or you wrote something in Columbus Monthly, I'm just pulling, about your work, that get co-authored, and that there be a way to say that that's also important work, as a way to look at the quality of the engagement, that you're kind of getting that out. And that's something we've got a long way to go in terms of sort of understanding where public-facing writing goes at all, but I think it should be in the equation.
So we probably have time for one further question from the audience.
Dana.
And also, this is a plug for the December Ethics of Community Engagement Care panel, which will talk some more about this.
Thank you. So my question is about when you're working on an interdisciplinary paper and say I'm one of the lead authors along with one or two other people who are also lead authors from one discipline, and we also have co-authors like in the middle from other disciplines. And we thought about the criteria for who is an author, but then when we send it out, like one of the middle authors says, oh, I think we should also include this person, but why is this person on here? And then it can get kind of very murky very fast as far as not only deciding who to include, but we're also navigating whether we should remove people from the author list who've already seen it and the kind of conflicts that can cause. So do you have any thoughts on how to deal with that kind of situation, and especially who has a say, who among the authors has a say and who else gets to be an author?
That's a good question.
So some journals will actually say, or some guidelines, I think it's the ICJME, or if I have that in the right order, actually says that the corresponding author determines who qualifies for authorship. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have a conversation about it early and often. And I think one of the things that you brought up in the preamble is the idea that people come and go from research groups, and I think that's the other thing where it gets very complicated. If it's a multi-year project, some people who are still here and working on a project may not even remember the contributions of somebody who left 2 years ago. And that can be contentious, but they're sitting out there somewhere thinking, I did that work, I contributed, and I expect my credit, when it comes out. So I think just having sort of open, ongoing collaborative discussions is really important. But if there's a dispute, it's often going to come back to the corresponding author.
All right, please thank our panel, and let's continue having these conversations with our teams.